History books are good at telling you the what: dates, names, victories, the rise and fall of empires. They tell you which emperor ruled, which armies marched, and which cities were conquered. They give you neat timelines and tidy summaries. But there's a problem. They rarely tell you the why or the how it felt to live through these times. And most importantly, they leave out the hidden truths, the things that make history messy, painful, and human. Take the Roman Empire, for example. Everyone knows the story of its collapse. The textbooks say barbarian invasions, economic collapse, or civil wars. And yes, all those factors matter, but they barely scratch the surface. The real collapse of Rome was not sudden. It was quiet, insidious, and deliberate. It happened inside the walls of palaces, senate chambers, and guard posts. Betrayal, corruption, and political games gnawed away at the empire long before the Visigoths marched on Rome. And these are the details most history books deliberately ignore. Imagine living in a world where the people you trusted the most, generals, senators, even those sworn to protect the emperor, could betray you in a heartbeat. Decisions were made not for the good of the empire, but for personal gain, power, and survival. Lives were sacrificed silently, removed from the records, erased so that future generations would never question the greatness of Rome. And yet, these human stories are the ones that define the collapse. This is why the first 10 seconds of this video are critical. Right now, as you're watching, you need to understand that this isn't a simple history lesson. This is a story about deception, fear, and the quiet unraveling of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. And it starts with betrayal, the kind that happens behind closed doors, in whispers and secret meetings, while the public only sees the surface. So, if you want to uncover the side of history they never taught you, if you want to see the Roman Empire not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing civilization filled with human ambition, fear, and fatal mistakes, then this story is for you. By the end of this video, you will realize that Rome didn't just fall because of invaders or economic decline. It fell because of the human weaknesses inside, the secrets that were hidden, and the truths that historians didn't want to teach. When most people think of history, they picture grand images, emperors sitting on thrones, armies clashing on battlefields, flags raised in victory. History seems like a story of progress, power, and triumph. But this perception is misleading. It hides the human cost, the suffering, and the quiet betrayals that often determine the fate of empires. And nowhere is this more true than in the story of the Roman Empire's collapse. History books give you the skeleton, dates, battles, and rulers, but they rarely provide the flesh and blood, the emotions and experiences of the ordinary people who lived through these events. They tell you Rome fell because of invaders or economic instability, but they rarely explain how internal corruption, personal ambition, and political treachery eroded the empire from within. Without understanding these invisible forces, history feels incomplete, almost fictional, a sanitized version designed to look neat on paper. Imagine living in a society where trust was a dangerous commodity. Allies could betray you in a heartbeat Senators could manipulate decisions for personal gain, and even those sworn to protect the empire, the Praetorian Guard, could turn against their own leaders. These are the hidden threads that slowly unraveled Rome, creating a foundation for collapse that was invisible to the casual observer. The true story of Rome's decline is not in grand battles or heroic acts. It's in whispered betrayals, secret power struggles, and the fear that permeated every level of society. Families watched silently as loved ones disappeared. Politicians plotted behind closed doors, and generals maneuvered for personal power rather than the good of the empire. These invisible wars, the silent erosion of trust and loyalty, created cracks that eventually swallowed one of the most powerful civilizations in history. By the end of this video, you will see Rome not as a clean, linear story of rise and fall, but as a complex human narrative filled with ambition, greed, fear, and tragedy. This is the part of history that textbooks won't teach. It's messy, uncomfortable, and real. And understanding it gives us not only insight into Rome's downfall, but also into the patterns of power, corruption, and human nature that continue to repeat themselves even today. History, in its true form, is never simple. It's a mix of triumph and terror, progress and pain, heroism and betrayal. And the Roman Empire's collapse is one of the clearest examples of this duality. A civilization that outwardly seemed invincible, yet fell quietly from within. This is the story they never taught you in school. And today, you're going to discover it. To understand why the Roman Empire fell, we must first step back and examine the world it controlled at its peak. The Roman Empire stretched from the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, encompassing countless cultures, languages, and territories. It was a civilization built on power, discipline, and organization. Its armies were unmatched, its roads and infrastructure legendary, and its laws were considered the standard for governance. From the outside, Rome appeared invincible. Its leaders commanded loyalty, its legions commanded fear, and its cities thrived under the weight of imperial authority. But beneath this impressive exterior, a different reality existed, one of fragility, vulnerability, and human imperfection. Power, as Rome demonstrated, is never absolute. It is only as strong as the people who wield it, and as stable as the trust and loyalty it can command. Within Rome's walls, ambition often outpaced ethics, and personal gain was prized above public good. Senators, generals, and even members of the emperor's own guard were capable of treachery, turning positions of responsibility into tools of manipulation and betrayal. Justice in Rome did not mean fairness, it meant control. Laws were not enforced impartially, they were applied according to rank, influence, and wealth. A minor insult or rivalry could lead to exile, imprisonment, or death, while powerful elites could evade accountability. Fear was embedded into the structure of society, not through chaos, but by calculated intimidation. The consequences of dissent were clear, creating a culture where silence became survival and obedience became the norm. Economic strain compounded the problem. The empire required enormous resources to maintain its armies, infrastructure, and administration. Heavy taxation burdened ordinary citizens, while corruption siphoned wealth into the hands of a few. Political instability meant that rulers changed frequently, often violently, creating a leadership vacuum. Every assassination, every coup, and every manipulated election weakened Rome's cohesion. And yet, all these internal pressures are barely discussed in conventional histories. Textbooks focus on battles, invasions, and dates, the visible and quantifiable, while the invisible rot of betrayal, fear, and political decay is left out. This omission gives the illusion that Rome fell suddenly due to external forces, rather than as the culmination of decades of internal failures. Understanding this context is essential. It explains why the empire could be vast and powerful, yet simultaneously fragile. It shows that history is not just about events, but about the environment in which humans operate, an environment where trust, fear, and ambition dictate outcomes as much as armies or laws. Without this context, the fall of Rome becomes a story of inevitability, rather than a complex narrative shaped by human choices and moral failures. The fall of the Roman Empire was not caused by a single event. It was a slow, relentless unraveling that happened over decades, and much of it began within Rome itself. Behind the grandeur of marble palaces, bustling forums, and ceremonial triumphs, a darker reality was at work. A reality defined by betrayal, ambition, and fear. Generals and senators frequently plotted against one another, not for the good of the empire, but for personal power. The Praetorian Guard, tasked with protecting the emperor, often became the ultimate political weapon, assassinating or manipulating leaders to place their preferred candidates on the throne. Loyalty was bought, sold, or broken, and trust became a scarce commodity. Every decision, every alliance, was tainted with self-interest. Even those closest to power were not safe. Secret meetings, bribes, and conspiracies were the invisible threads that wove the empire's eventual collapse. For the ordinary citizens, the consequences were devastating. Families witnessed sudden disappearances. Wealth and property were confiscated arbitrarily. Political instability made survival a daily struggle. Emperors changed, laws shifted, and the people had little say in the matters that ruled their lives. Fear became a currency more valuable than gold, and silence became a survival strategy. The everyday lives of Romans were shaped not just by battles on distant frontiers, but by the invisible wars fought in the corridors of power. Rome's economic systems further fueled instability. Over-reliance on taxation, coupled with rampant corruption among officials, left the average citizen burdened and resentful. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of elites, who often used their influence to manipulate the legal and military systems. Meanwhile, external pressures such as barbarian migrations and invasions tested the empire's fragile internal cohesion, exposing weaknesses created by years of internal decay. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how normalized it became. Betrayal, violence, and fear were no longer anomalies. They were the expected order of life. By the time the Visigoths entered Rome in 410 CE, the empire's foundation had already been hollowed out. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable consequence of generations of human weakness, corruption, and moral compromise. Understanding the main story of Rome's fall requires seeing beyond the textbook's neat timelines. It requires recognizing that the greatest threats were not always external. The empire fell because its people, from rulers to ordinary citizens, became prisoners of fear, ambition, and silence. And in this human tragedy lies the real lesson. History is not just dates and victories. It is the study of choices, consequences, and the hidden forces that shape civilizations. As the Roman Empire continued to weaken from within, fear and instability became the invisible rulers of everyday life. The once glorious city of Rome, filled with monumental architecture and bustling markets, was no longer immune to the consequences of betrayal, political chaos, and corruption. Citizens, soldiers, and officials alike began to live under the constant shadow of uncertainty. Every action carried risk. Every alliance carried hidden danger. And over time, this fear became normalized, almost invisible. Yet it dictated the empire's fate more than armies or borders ever could. Political infighting escalated to unprecedented levels. Senators schemed in hidden chambers, and generals who were once heroes of Rome plotted coups and manipulated legions to assert personal dominance. Power struggles were not occasional disruptions. They were continuous, systemic, and increasingly violent. Even emperors who were meant to embody Rome's strength found themselves at the mercy of those they trusted most. The Praetorian Guard, entrusted with protecting the emperor, frequently used this position to decide who would rule, often through murder or coercion. Political authority became a game of fear and manipulation, leaving the population powerless and the empire internally fractured. Meanwhile, ordinary Romans suffered quietly. Families lost their breadwinners to political purges. Property was seized arbitrarily. Taxation became harsher as the government sought to sustain its enormous military and administrative machine, further draining already struggling citizens. Communities learned to live under silent terror, adopting obedience as a survival mechanism. Public trust evaporated, and silence became the default response to injustice. This culture of fear wasn't just emotional, it was structural. Institutions meant to maintain order instead reinforced anxiety and control. At the same time, the empire faced external pressures. Barbarian groups pressed against Rome's borders, sensing the internal fragility. Invasions and migrations were not the ultimate cause of collapse, but they accelerated what was already inevitable. The internal rot made Rome incapable of mounting an effective defense. Leadership vacuums and constant power struggles meant that military strategy suffered, further amplifying the empire's vulnerability. And yet, perhaps the most chilling part is how normal this instability became. By the later stages of the empire, generations grew up accepting betrayal, political murder, and arbitrary punishment as the natural order. Fear had become a culture, inherited by each new generation. Rome's collapse was not simply the result of a single catastrophe. It was the outcome of decades of normalized fear, corruption, and human weakness. This escalation shows a clear pattern. Empires do not fall solely because of external threats. They fall because of internal decay, when fear replaces trust and ambition replaces morality. And in Rome, this silent internal erosion became the unstoppable force that eventually brought one of the greatest civilizations in history to its knees. The true climax of Rome's story is not the moment the Visigoths marched through the city gates in 410 CE. It's the culmination of decades of internal decay, betrayal, and normalized fear that left the empire vulnerable long before any external threat arrived. This is where the human side of history becomes most disturbing. It's not armies or battles alone that topple civilizations. It's the choices, compromises, and moral failures of people who wield power. In Rome, these forces reached a peak that the textbooks never fully reveal. By this point, the empire's leadership was a revolving door of assassinations, coups, and manipulations. Emperors were no longer respected figures of authority. They were pawns in a lethal game of survival. Every decision was calculated not for the good of Rome, but to maintain personal power or protect immediate allies. Even the military, once the backbone of Roman dominance, was influenced by politics, bribery, and divided loyalties. Discipline weakened, loyalty fractured, and competence became secondary to ambition. The system itself, built to protect Rome, had become an instrument of its destruction. The effects on the population were profound. Ordinary citizens lived with constant fear, knowing that arbitrary violence could strike anywhere, anytime. Families lost loved ones to purges. Communities watched silently as influential figures disappeared without explanation. Economic hardship compounded anxiety. High taxes, inflation, and social inequality left millions struggling just to survive. Fear became a culture. Obedience was not voluntary, it was a necessity. And this culture of fear, cultivated over generations, was far more powerful than any invading force. Meanwhile, corruption and decay eroded Rome's infrastructure and governance. Roads fell into disrepair, cities faced shortages, and the administration became inefficient. The combination of internal weakness and external pressures created a tipping point. By the time barbarian forces entered Roman territories, the empire was already hollowed out. The fall of Rome was not sudden. It was the logical outcome of centuries of human flaws left unchecked. Modern historians now recognize this truth. The collapse of Rome was not just political or military. It was moral and cultural. The cracks were internal long before any army set foot on Roman soil. Betrayal, greed, fear, and silence had built an empire on unstable foundations. The peak moment of this story is realizing that history is not written solely by heroes or conquerors, but by every choice humans make, including the failures and weaknesses that determine the fate of civilizations. And when you see this, the Visigoth sack of Rome is no longer just an event. It becomes the final act of a tragedy that had been centuries in the making. A stark reminder of what happens when fear and corruption replace trust and morality in human society. The fall of Rome teaches us something far deeper than the collapse of a city or an empire. It teaches us about human nature and the consequences of choices repeated over generations. History is not a series of isolated events. It is the cumulative effect of decisions, ethics, and failures. Rome did not fall because of a single invasion or a single bad ruler. It fell because a culture of fear, corruption, and moral compromise had become ingrained into every level of society. This is the realization that transforms how we see history. Imagine a society where loyalty is transactional, where ambition supersedes ethics, and where the ordinary person has no voice. Over time, this environment reshapes the people who live in it. Fear becomes instinctual. Obedience becomes habit. Citizens stop asking questions. Families accept injustice. And leaders prioritize self-interest over collective good. The cycle of internal decay becomes self-perpetuating. Those in power act in ways that weaken the system further, while those without power adjust to survive. And in this way, human behavior, repeated over decades, becomes the most powerful force in shaping civilizations. When we look at Rome, we see that history is often sanitized in textbooks. We are told dates, battles, and victories. We celebrate emperors and generals, but we rarely confront the uncomfortable truths that ordinary people suffered, that corruption undermined governance, and that fear kept citizens from resisting tyranny. The realization is simple yet profound. History is rarely about heroes or villains alone. It is about the choices people make when systems fail them, and the consequences of moral compromise. This understanding also applies beyond Rome. Every empire, kingdom, or civilization is vulnerable to the same patterns. Betrayal, ambition, fear, and silence are timeless forces. They shape human societies in ways that official records rarely capture. And by studying them, we gain insight not only the past, but also the present. We start to see why certain societies crumble while others endure, why some leaders fail and others succeed, and how cultural values, trust, morality, and accountability can determine the fate of nations. The ultimate lesson is that history is not a passive record of what happened. It is an active reflection of human behavior, decisions, and morality. The fall of Rome is a mirror, showing us that civilizations are fragile when fear and corruption dominate. And the realization, as uncomfortable as it may be, is that without understanding these lessons, we are doomed to repeat them. As we reach the end of this story, the collapse of Rome stands as more than a historical event. It is a stark warning. Empires rise and fall not only through battles fought on the battlefield, but through the subtle, invisible erosion of trust, morality, and human responsibility. What began as ambition and pride gradually transformed into fear, corruption, and silence. The lessons of Rome are not buried in the ruins alone. They live in every choice societies make and in every moment where ethics are compromised for convenience or power. The greatest lie of history is not that empires fall, but that the collapse is inevitable. In reality, Rome's decline was preventable. It could have been slowed, mitigated, or perhaps even avoided if leaders had chosen integrity over ambition, courage over fear, and justice over self-interest. Ordinary citizens too had a role. Silence and compliance enabled the corruption to take root. The fall was not only political, it was moral. It teaches us that civilizations are fragile when the very people who sustain them allow fear and greed to dictate their actions. And yet, there is hope in this lesson. By examining history honestly, we uncover the patterns that allowed great powers to crumble. We see the consequences of unchecked ambition, and we recognize the importance of accountability, transparency, and moral courage. History becomes more than dates and victories. It becomes a guide for understanding human nature and the dynamics that shape society. Now, as you reflect on the fall of Rome, consider this. Every empire, kingdom, and institution in human history has faced similar forces. Fear, corruption, and betrayal are timeless adversaries. By learning from the mistakes of the past, we can prepare for the challenges of the future. Understanding history is not just an academic exercise. It is essential for preventing repeated mistakes. Before we close, remember this. The stories you never hear in classrooms are often the ones that matter most. The suffering, the corruption, the silenced voices, these are the truths that define the rise and fall of civilizations. And if this truth was hidden from us, what else remains unseen in the history we are taught today?